not muted anymore. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And it's really wonderful that due to the magic of video conferencing combined with the magic of pandemic, I could be in California 2 hours ago, and now I'm in China together with all of you. The travel is getting a lot easier. I will try to be a little bit provocative, and the title of my talk is The Age of Vanishing Marginal Cost. So let me start with a little bit of economic history here. So not since early 1900s have we seen tech so rapidly transforming the society. And here's a picture taken in 1900s, around year 1900. And you see a famous street corner in Manhattan. And what you see there are a lot of horses. And what you don't see there are any cars. And here's the same street corner, just 20 years later, early 1920s. And what you see there are a lot of cars and no horses. So in 2 decades, 100,000 horses that were powering the transportation in New York City just disappeared. Lots of jobs for people who serviced those horses disappeared too. Those people found new jobs. They were okay. Well, that was rapid technological change. And we are experiencing that kind of change again. And here's just a laundry list of technologies. And I put together that laundry list a long time ago. And I just added one yesterday. Work from home is becoming kind of a new technology in some sense. We had video conferencing for a while, but we only recently discovered that it's actually possible to work from home. In fact, one of the things that I was doing before pandemic was started, I was getting ready a small pilot inside Microsoft for work from home. We are planning to do a few hundred people starting in June. Well, guess what? Instead, we had the entire company working from home starting in March. So that's pandemic is certainly a lot of pain for a lot of people, but also a great accelerator. And by the way, all the measures of productivity, anything measurable basically shows that work from home pretty much works. And people seem to prefer to work from home. Now again, going down the history lane, but a little bit farther than 1900s, let's go back to the 18th century. Let's look at major 18th century innovations. And you see steam engine that was under patent from 1769 till 1800. Another innovation that truly transformed Western civilization was introduction of potato to Europe. Potato didn't have any IP protection, unlike steam engine, although arguably it wasn't any less important. With steam engine, you see enormous spike in innovation after the patent expires. You see enormous increases in both power and energy efficiency of steam engines. It kind of feels like IP protection, and also in that just sheer number of steam engines that are being sold. So you see how IP protection created a monopoly that was sort of harmful for keeping prices high, innovation low. Then you look at potato, no IP protection, and you see that actually potato was introduced to Europe. It took potatoes 200 years to truly become a staple in Europe. So no IP protection, maybe no panacea. Maybe if someone would have had property rights for potatoes for 30 years, maybe potatoes would have spread faster. So hard to say which way IP cuts. So also copyright is introduced in early 1700s in England, not in the US. So we don't have good measures of the ratio between marginal cost and the price. We don't have those measures for 1700s. We don't have those measures for 21st century. But it is, I think, a very safe guess that marginal cost was a really large fraction of 18th century prices of books, of steam engines, and also of potato chips and of potatoes. Well, how do we know that? So, for example, if you read the parliamentary debate in England about introducing copyright, even before they introduced copyright, they expect that introducing copyright would add just a small percentage to the cost of a book. Because at the time, the marginal cost of books is extremely high. So adding copyright, yes, increases the price, but by a fairly small percentage. So in contrast, today in 21st century, we know exactly the marginal cost of ebooks. It's about zero. So surely copyright introduces enormous price premium right there. We could be relatively certain that in 21st century, pharmaceutical industry, GPU chips all have marginal costs. That's a fairly small fraction of price. Well, I'd like to make a provocative statement. I think marginal cost is really vanishing in 21st century. And obviously, there are kind of obvious examples of low marginal cost industries: software, digital goods, social network, pharmaceuticals, search engines. In search engines, you have not only sort of very high fixed cost, you also have with scale comes data, with data comes higher quality. So those are all industries with like really low marginal costs. Then there are a bunch of industries where marginal costs are not negligible at all, but nevertheless not super high and arguably declining. In particular, if you look at cloud market, infrastructure as a service, you see pretty significant marginal costs. They're definitely not zero, but it's also worth noticing that the true economic marginal cost for cloud services is actually significantly lower than the marginal cost that a cloud provider faces. So let me explain. A cloud provider buys hardware, and from cloud provider's point of view, hardware is a true variable cost. However, the hardware itself has a pretty big markup, especially for certain parts of types of hardware. So true economic marginal cost should take into account that hardware should look at hardware's marginal cost, not the hardware cost paid by the cloud provider. So to be sure, even cloud providers don't estimating marginal cost is very difficult. So academic economists don't know what they are. Even firms don't know what they are. Estimating marginal cost of a cloud provider is really difficult. For example, you have to know how likely your data center is to run into capacity constraint, and you have to know if your data center runs into size constraint in terms of real estate. Would it be possible to cheaply add more real estate, or are we up against binding constraint? And so on and so forth. So even for the firms itself, estimating marginal cost is quite challenging. So there are a bunch of other industries where I think we see increasing fixed costs, declining marginal costs. So we see it with automation and manufacturing. We also may start seeing more and more of it in customer service and in all kinds of services. We're already seeing some of that with automated customer assistance, with chatbots, but I think in the future we'll see more and more of that. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 20 years, a barber would be a piece of software. So it would be all fixed costs and very little marginal cost for getting a haircut, something that's certainly not the case today. Also, we are already seeing retailers moving towards more automated stores, again, higher fixed costs, low marginal costs. So I would say marginal costs are probably the smallest fraction of the price that they have ever been, and they're probably going to get lower and lower. So this is from a recent paper from QG that looks at the markups, and obviously there's a aggregate data, very imperfect, but you see that average markups are really going through the roof over the last half a century. Actually, the methodology used in the paper doesn't deal very well with fixed costs. So, for example, the software industry would not necessarily look as very low markup, very high markup industry here, although it is. So what are the consequences of vanishing marginal costs? And I think those consequences are really important for economy and for economists. So first of all, there's something that I call the rise of the middleman. So one thing that I found striking as a practitioner is how much effort and how much time is being spent on all kind of go-to-market effort, acquiring a customer, marketing, advertisement, making sure that the product is sticky, making sure that the product is viral, and so on and so forth. So that's just this enormous, super important cost. So for example, you look at Netflix, they spent $312 million on US marketing in Q4 2019, and that's $204 for each new paid subscriber. So that means that it takes them like 4 years to cover that cost. So that's what I call kind of a middleman economy. It's a non-productive, enormous waste of resources in some sense from social point of view, certainly not from Netflix's point of view. And that's very common for all kinds of businesses with low marginal cost. When you have marginal cost that's, 90% of your cost, well, if you're selling something for $1, the most you would spend on user acquisition is 10 cents. Well, if your marginal cost is zero, you're selling something for $1 for a marginal unit, you may be willing to spend up to $1 on basically hustling, and that could be ineffective, unproductive waste of funds that's socially not useful. So I think we as economists should really worry about it. So there's another consequence. The invisible hand, the first welfare theorem, depends on diminishing a constant returns to scale. And as we move towards increasing returns to scale economy, where marginal cost is vanishing, the very theoretical foundation of capitalism that tells us, hey, free enterprise yields an efficient outcome, well, theoretically, it's no longer need not be true anymore. So what are the open questions here? So first, I will refer to efficiency gap as the ratio between GDP and production possibility GDP on production possibility frontier and actual GDP. So for any given state of technology, there's a GDP that we achieve, and there's a GDP that we could have achieved if we had the first best outcome. So the difference between the two I will call efficiency gap. So how does efficiency gap change over time? I don't know. But I suspect it's growing. And the reason that I suspect it's growing is that our technological possibility was growing enormously over the last half a century, but our economy was not growing enormously. It was growing, but it doesn't feel like it was growing as fast as our technological possibilities. So then there's a question, are increasing returns to blame for widening efficiency gap? If there's a widening efficiency gap, does inefficiently high sales effort cause greater distortion than duplication of fixed costs? So obviously when you have high fixed cost, low marginal cost. You have multiple firms, you have competition, so fixed costs are duplicated, that's not efficient. That's one source of inefficiency. The other source of inefficiency, everybody has enormous incentive to like push that extra marginal unit. So all those are open questions. I think they're super important. And well, I don't know the answers and nobody else does. Thank you.